Do you love coffee and Monero as much as we do? Consider making gratuitous.org your daily cup. Pay with Monero for premium fresh beans, and if you like what you taste, send a digital cash tip directly to the Guatemalan farmers that made it possible. Proceeds help us grow this channel, Gratuitous, and Monero. This week on Monero Talk is sponsored by Cake Wallet. Store, send, receive, and exchange your Monero and Bitcoin safely on iOS and Android too. Cake Wallet is open source, and you always control your own keys. And by Sweetwater Digital Asset Consulting, connecting new money with old money since 2018. Cake Wallet and Sweetwater Digital are trusted and verified by the Monero community. Monero Talk is also made possible from contributions by viewers and listeners like you. This week on Monero Talk, Douglas Tuman interviews Andrew Balthazor, currently a judicial law clerk at the United States District Court for the Southern District in Florida and author of a legal research paper that applies the Bona Fide acquisition rule to cryptocurrency. The Bona Fide acquisition rule is a common law principle that originates from Roman law that allows an innocent purchaser to acquire certain types of stolen property free from the risk that the property may be claimed by the rightful owner. One such property that the rule applies to is cash, primarily for the policy reason that in order for commerce to flow freely, innocent receivers of cash in a transaction should not be at risk of having someone claim ownership to the cash they received. Whereas with property like a painting, the rule would not apply, and the innocent purchaser of a stolen painting would not be considered the rightful owner if it can be proven to have been stolen. In this episode, Andrew discusses his analysis, which focused on Bitcoin, and boils down to whether Bitcoin should be considered cash-like, or rather, should be considered more like property with traceable title ownership given its transparent ledger. Doug and Andrew apply the same analysis to Monero, reasoning the bona fide acquisition rule would more clearly apply to Monero than Bitcoin, given Monero's cash-like fungibility. The ultimate deduction being Monero acts better as money than Bitcoin. Monero Talk starts now.
Andrew, thanks, man. Thanks for joining me.
Of course.
So I know this was this kind of random to you that I reached out to you to come on to this show. What was your
Yes, it was
reaction?
a little random. Well, plus the nature of my paper doesn't really suit, like the topic of it doesn't really suit privacy coins, because it really discusses, it's this particular legal principle's application to cryptocurrencies that you can trace the transaction using a publicly viewable blockchain. So
Yes. So we might as well jump right into it, just so I guess people know what we're talking about. I don't even know how I came across you. I was just having thoughts and I was Googling. I may have even Googled, the topic of your paper out of just sheer curiosity, wondering how law currently handles, Bitcoin in terms of the bona fide acquisition rule. I went to law school. I am an attorney. I don't really practice much. And so I found your paper very interesting. And what interests me most about it is that it potentially reveals in a very clear way as to, to the fact that Bitcoin is not fungible, and that because of that, this property that normally, or this rule that normally applies to money, may not apply to cryptocurrencies, and in particular Bitcoin, because of its lack of fungibility. So that's why I wanted to get you on, and how I see it related to the topic of privacy coins. But we'll get into that. But I think the first thing is to really, I guess, just explain what the paper really is, and what the purpose of it is, and what essentially your findings were. And we'll kind of go take it from there.
Okay, so the paper discusses a particular legal rule that applies to property. And ordinarily, when something is stolen from you, you can go get that property back from the thief, no question. But if that thief sells it to somebody, it becomes a little murkier. So depending on the context, sometimes you can go to the purchaser who bought it from the thief and acquire that property. It depends on certain principles. One, does the buyer know that he's acquiring stolen goods? If he knows, then you can always recover your property from the purchaser. But if he's an innocent purchaser and he doesn't know that what he's buying is stolen goods, then you still may be prevented from recovering from him if certain rules apply. And generally, we apply that rule to cash. So if someone steals a pile of money and a car and sells buys something from a third party, doesn't know it, that the thief is paying in cash, and now the innocent third party has a big pile of stolen cash, and then he sells the stolen car to a third party. Now, under our legal principles, we'll allow you to get the stolen car back from the innocent purchaser, even though he didn't know it was stolen, because you can identify the specific vehicle using a VIN and a title registry that all states have, that this vehicle belongs to you. But the pile of cash, even if you recorded all the serial numbers of the cash, we wouldn't let you go recover that cash from the purchaser. You have to go to the thief and do a lawsuit against the thief if you can identify him. And if you can't, you're out of luck. So this principle is called the bona fide acquisition rule, which means that if an innocent purchaser we call it a bona fide purchaser, someone who is not aware of the theft, the original theft. If he acquires it, you can sometimes recover your stolen goods from him in certain situations and not in others. So cash is a good example. If it's a unique piece of art, you will be able to recover it because it's something that you could point to and say, this is mine because it's the only one of its kind. So it must be mine. Or like I said, a vehicle that's titled and has a registry, or even a gun, maybe if it's registered and there's a serial number that you can trace, a bicycle. But something that's fungible, like a Bitcoin, that would be potentially recoverable. And that was the topic of the paper, exploring whether this rule applies to cryptocurrencies or not. Do we treat it like cash or do we treat it like something unique? So
right. So let's back up, because it's something, my understanding is that, it applies to cash because cash is fungible, right? So you wouldn't easily be able to unwind or unmix the receiving. They even go back to, I think, ancient Roman times, right, where this came up, and they talk about the mixing of, I guess, the coins that were received with the person's personal coins, to the point where you wouldn't be able to untangle them and determine which coins were which. The idea being that because the coins are essentially fungible, that it wouldn't make sense to allow the property to be taken away from the bona fide purchaser, property being the money in this instance, the coins, and going back to what was potentially the rightful owner of the property, because they had the property first, and I guess it was stolen from them. And so fungibility actually plays into how it's assessed whether or not the bona fide actual acquisition rule applies to something, which makes sense. And then there's policy reasons as to why you'd want to apply that to money, because you wouldn't want to create a situation where you're making it difficult for transactions to happen, because every time somebody received money, they would then have to do the due diligence of trying to figure out whether or not the money was actually stolen or not. Right? Is that, I know I'm kind of butchering it a little bit, but is that the essence of?
Right. It started first in Roman times, in the principle that you just can't prove that one coin is yours and not another. the maxim was money has no earmark. So the actual full rule talks about how if you put your coins in a sack and sealed it with a special seal that identified the sack as yours, then you could recover that if the sack was unopened, because you could prove that's yours. But if it's just coins mixed with some other pile of coins, you can't prove that it's yours versus someone else's. That eventually evolved when we started having paper currency that did have identifiable numbers, serial numbers. Courts applied another principle, the idea that we want to reduce transaction costs to encourage free flow of the economic flow of resources, including currency. So the only way to do that is to have to not force people to check some register for stolen currency, and every time that they purchase something, look at the serial numbers and cross-reference it with maybe some master list of stolen serial numbers, which would be unwieldy. That applied to paper currency, but the question of this paper was whether we should continue to apply it to certain cryptocurrencies where theoretically the blockchain does allow you to check for stolen, a source of stolen funds.
Exactly. So this is obviously where it gets very interesting. And this was, the essence of your paper, trying to figure that out. So what would you say today, based on your analysis? Do you think it should apply the bona fide acquisition rule? Should it apply to, let's say, Bitcoin? What's your kind of finding there?
So I concluded that although it's possible to trace if you had a listing of illegally obtained Bitcoins, like say we list all of the addresses that hacks go into, or fraudulently obtained coins, we kind of can trace where those coins go to a certain extent using the blockchain. But there really is no central clearinghouse for an end user to check whether their coins have come from one of these wallets. It's pretty difficult to do. So I concluded, although Bitcoin might have the capability, like you could maybe have a third-party, private software that does that for you, or you could maybe require it of certain like higher level entities that have more capabilities. It's probably too cumbersome right now, and that the added transaction costs probably don't warrant not applying the bona fide acquisition rule to Bitcoin. But I did discuss that if you wanted to, you could. It could be a feature of either Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies where someone could flag something as stolen, and it would make it very difficult for that thief to use that currency, which might be, a great positive in some circumstances. I mean, there's a lot of, mechanics to work out for that. Because you'd have to make sure that you're not flagging a legitimate transaction as something illegal, because that would be prone to abuse.
Right. And this is all very interesting, because it's happening in real time. We're seeing the development of this happening in Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in general. I'm sure you're familiar with chain analytics companies that are actively analyzing the Bitcoin blockchain. Many of them funded with millions of dollars, often by the kind of the same people that are behind the established banking industry. And as you pointed out, there's a reason why, there are arguments for why there's positives to that, right? Certainly being able to track and trace potentially nefarious transactions, to make sure things are going in accordance with the Bank Secrecy Act. And then for the purposes of just people being able to properly track their own property and, use it as evidence as to whether or not something has been stolen and is rightfully theirs. I mean, essentially, the Bitcoin blockchain does keep a record of ownership. So it's built into the technology itself. It's a ledger that's constantly keeping track of who owns what. So it's kind of the perfect invention for this purpose of using it in the instance where you need to prove ownership. And I see you were saying, well, it may require may add too much friction to transactions, but it does seem like we're headed in the direction where it could seamlessly be integrated into the technology of Bitcoin, where every transaction you could kind of, like you said, things can be flagged and you can kind of seamlessly make an assessment as to whether or not the Bitcoins you're receiving are, I guess, clean or not, right?
Well, I think it would, if that could be integrated, you might have a cryptocurrency that would be less prone to nefarious uses, potentially, in the same way that cell phones in countries where you can report a stolen cell phone and they will flag the hardware MEI number of that cell phone and prevent it from accessing the mobile network. So if we could flag stolen cryptocurrency in the same way, using a publicly available blockchain, you would make any stolen cryptocurrency completely useless to whatever thief took it. But like I said, that's prone to abuse. And so actually implementing a system like that, because I could buy something, a legitimate transaction, and then, just flag it as illegitimate. So there has to be some, controls in place, but there's a potential for some upside there. It's just not available right now.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously, so that would be controlled by some government and government entities, right? That would have that authority to essentially taint Bitcoins and create that database. And we're already seeing that being done. The U.S. Treasury Department has blacklisted various Bitcoin wallets associated with different groups. So we're already seeing it done. So it seems like we're only going to continue to move in that direction.
Although it doesn't have to be a government mandated process. The diamond industry is an example of a privately run method of preventing trade in stolen diamonds. And that governments aren't involved in that. Instead, they use this Kimberley process, which is them all agreeing that we are going to certify diamonds coming from certain locations. And this is what the certificates are going to look like. This is who can issue them, so that we know from the source of the diamond that it's coming from not like a conflict region where we don't want to trade with. And then a jeweler or retailer or wholesaler is only going to buy diamonds that have those certificates. Now, there's people who are willing to deal in the illegitimate diamonds, and there will always be some kind of black market like that, but they're difficult to trade. And there's consequences for getting caught, and there's a government side to the enforcement of dealing in the illegal diamonds, but there's the private side of that is all sort of voluntary in order to, I think, raise the value of the legitimate diamonds that are mined and used. So there's a possible example there of a private, public cooperation, and I think the diamond industry did that to prevent government, infringing too much in their business. So that might apply to cryptocurrency exchanges too.
Yeah, no, that's a great example, and actually, I guess that's probably more accurate as to what the likely direction of things. So once again, what interests me most about this is I'm constantly looking at cryptocurrency and trying to determine which one is doing digital cash the best, right? So that's kind of been my motivation in this space. That's what I'm most interested in. That's what I think the true value of proposition of cryptocurrency is. That's what I think the most disruptive aspect of it is the one that can do digital cash or digital gold the best. And so I started off as a Bitcoin maximalist, went down that rabbit hole, but I realized, that Bitcoin isn't fungible because of these reasons we're talking about. It's built on a transparent ledger. You can basically track and trace transactions. And because of that, you could effectively taint wallets or taint coins. And that's what led me to Monero, which is essentially resistant to this. It's, also blockchain technology, also has a ledger, but it implements, other tech that essentially obfuscates all the transactions. So you can't see who's sending what to whom. And so just curious, based on your research, do you think Bitcoin essentially doesn't work well as money because of this, because of its nature to be tracked and traced? When we look at, based on, there was things that stuck out in that paper that made a kind of alarm bells go off for me. When you talk about the fungibility of it, when you talk about how they assessed cash historically, and basically said for the need of, allowing the free flow of commerce, that they're not going to, that the bona fide acquisition rule will apply. Do you have any opinion there as to what that means for defining Bitcoin as money?
Well, I think it certainly raises concerns. If it's a medium of exchange, but it's not necessarily fungible. So does that make it not money? People treat it like money, but I think you raise some interesting points, that it's the lack of privacy between of a third party. I understand with Monero you can use a view key to enable at your if you want, you can enable a third party to look at the transactions for a particular address. Is that right?
Correct.
Right. So unless you give that out, no one can tell where your transactions are going, which is largely what you have when you receive cash, right? Like a traditional fiat cash. If you receive $100, you have no idea where that came from without some kind of other independent information. So in that sense, Bitcoin is not like money because it has memory. Everything that you transact with Bitcoin or a lot of other publicly available blockchain-based currencies, you can tell where that stuff came from, which requires people to bend over backwards to try to hide what they're doing by using one use only digital addresses or tumblers or services that let you trade without know your customer regulations involved, and governments are locking down on some of those avenues. So I think there are some problems with that. I mean, there's advantages as we discussed, but
yeah, it seems like that's becoming the value proposition of Bitcoin. So it's really not digital cash, not digital gold, right? Because when I give you a piece of gold, there's no question as to what is the history attached to this piece of gold. You have no way of assessing that. So you just take that piece of gold, and there's no due diligence that's then required to go try to figure out if that gold came from somewhere nefarious, because it would essentially be impossible to do so. With Bitcoin, it's quite easy to do that research because it's built into the technology. So Bitcoin really isn't acting as digital gold or digital cash. It's acting as this other new type of property that's great for owning. People are currently storing their value in it. And I guess the fact that you easily can track and trace maybe even adds to that ability to store value in it, because if it were to be stolen, you can use the blockchain to help track and trace and determine the rightful owner, which sounds great in theory. And I think there are a lot of reasons why I guess that is good. But ultimately, if you're trying to create digital cash, it's not going to work for those purposes.
And there's a number of reasons why you wouldn't want publicly available transactions. And although it might help with enforcement of anti-money laundering and know your customer regulations, and preventing funding of terrorists or helping black market crimes of various sorts, or tracing thefts so that you can get your property back. It's bad from the perspective that your competitors can see, what kind of business dealings you're doing. People who maybe want to hurt you could see what you're spending your money on once they identify which addresses are associated with you and your spending habits. And that's not something that people really want out there all that much. So there might be benefit to cryptocurrencies where you can view the transactions publicly when you affirmatively want that information out there. Like, for example, I could see it in equity dealings where you want to use digital assets as collateral and prove to a third party that you're not moving that asset, that this asset's going to stay there and act as security for some other purpose, in which case they know. But as we discussed with Monero, you could do that by giving them the view key for that address. So I'm not sure that necessarily is required to have everybody view it. It might be good in instances where, I guess, you have positions of public trust. So like politicians who are in office, having them and their investments, like if they have a blind trust set up, or don't have a blind trust set up, or just have assets out there, and you want to give your constituents or political parties the confidence that you are not investing for your own interest, aligning with your legislative votes, but you're just investing blindly as you should, then you could leave that information publicly for people. But most private citizens don't need that.
Makes a lot of sense to me. I'm constantly struggling, having this debate with the Bitcoin community, especially there are some that, or most actually, that also consider themselves libertarians. Some even consider themselves anarchists, and they see Bitcoin as this grand savior and the thing that's going to essentially take power away from the state and give more power to individuals. But, I'm concerned that because of Bitcoin's traceability, that it won't necessarily have that effect, because you'll be able to see everyone's transactions. And as you can imagine, that could lead to things like, mass surveillance and knowing how, what people are doing with their money. And it could lead to worst case scenarios, tyrannies, right, where people with enough power or that are in power can essentially use their ability to analyze and track and trace the Bitcoin blockchain, and if everybody's using it, to basically watch certain individuals and mark people if they make certain types of transactions, donate to certain political causes, whatever it may be. And that's my ultimate concern or argument as to why we may want to be wary of Bitcoin and, think about something more along the lines of Monero, where the base layer isn't transparent, but it's obfuscated.
The worst case, I think, is if governments start to realize just how much information is available and they realize how to mine it efficiently, they might mandate that people use transactions like this and prevent traditional, fiat currency and private coin, use, which would be concerning.
Right, and the most tragic part of it is the people who are leading the charge into this are those that are claiming to be the most concerned about our liberties and saying we need to all port over to Bitcoin because it's going to, give us more liberty from the powers that be. Meanwhile, we're potentially all opting into a tool that can be kind of the perfect tool for surveilling everyone's transactions.
It would be like if the government required everyone to use Facebook and use Facebook to update their status religiously, their relationships, their friend lists, with daily updates. That is not a world that I think most people would want to live in.
Exactly. So what led you to write this paper? What is, let's talk about that a little bit. I know we jumped right into the topic, but let's talk about a little bit how you even got here. Why'd you write this paper?
So I started working at a big law firm, and it's started in Florida, but it's now international. It's called Holland and Knight. And when I first got there, day one of orientation, I heard some of the partners talking about how one of the partners had gotten assigned to be involved in an SEC action against a crypto Ponzi scheme, essentially. And this company had raised money to try to put out a product that it really wasn't capable of putting out, and maybe never intended to put out. And it raised over $20 million in Ethereum. And the SEC found out about it, and then after they started getting investigated, all the money went missing. And they said it was a hack. And it actually turned out, it looked like it probably was stolen from them by somebody. So we came in at the point of the SEC starting to investigate. The court had appointed us as the receiver for the company. And it was our job to try to marshal the assets, the virtual assets in this case, which we had some remaining, but we had to try to, I was given the task as a brand new associate of trying to track down the about 21 million in Ether that had been stolen. And I used the public blockchain to do that, the public Ethereum blockchain. And we were able to track at least part of it down to an exchange in Hong Kong. And at that Hong Kong exchange, they cooperated with us. They froze the accounts that they could identify where funds were still there at the time that we had made the inquiry, and they had some know your customer information for those accounts. So we were able to identify the person who was at least in receipt of the stolen Ether. Now, that's a far cry from saying that he was the person who did the hack. He may have just been an innocent purchaser, which started me thinking about this rule and whether it applied to him, and whether, even if he wasn't involved, whether we could recover. Hong Kong uses British law, which is the same law that we're derived from here in the United States. Common law all originates from basically England. So it was more of a thought experiment, although we did hire some Hong Kong attorneys to prosecute the case. And since that time, I've taken a hiatus. I'm working for a judge, so I don't actually know how that Hong Kong action has turned out. But I tend to, when I go back, I want to get back involved with some of that work.
Very interesting. So do you think the bona fide acquisition rule would then clearly apply to Monero, because we're saying it's more like cash in that, it is fungible, it can't be tracked and traced?
Yes, I think the key thing that would make it difficult is is the inability to trace back to a source of illegitimate funding. So there's no way, as an innocent purchaser, even if you were doing due diligence, there's no way for you to verify. And even if you insisted that the person selling you the stolen currency, insist that they give you their view key so you can see where their funds came from, that only gives you one layer of information. You wouldn't know where that person got their funds from. So it might be stolen 3 or 4 or 5 links down the chain or farther, and you can only tell one hop. So I don't think that we could say Monero would be treated like some unique property. I think we'd have to treat it more like cash, and you wouldn't be able to recover under that rule from an innocent purchaser. You have to find either the thief who took it or some other mechanism to get your assets back.
Interesting. And so have you been studying cryptocurrency since this, or was that just something you dabbled in because of being at the firm at that time? And
Well, our firm has, like most big firms, they've got a little virtual asset and blockchain practice. So the lead for our firm is based here in Miami, where I live. And when I go back, I'll be doing some more work with him. And when I was there, he had taken on another case to help the SEC with distribution of assets for the Veritasium coin, which was another one of these quasi Ponzi scheme ICOs. And that was, I think, 8 million or so in assets. So they had seized that. What he had done was he hadn't had his assets stolen. So he had about 8 million, and a lot of it he had either converted into Bitcoin or purchased like gold and silver and some other like actual resources with his money. And what the SEC wanted us to do was find a way to identify the claimants who had been damaged by the fraud and then get money back to them, which presented us with a challenge on a public blockchain. Because if you say, okay, everyone who purchased Veritasium coins is a potential claimant because they have purchased thinking that they were buying something for value when really it was a fraud. They've all been damaged. We want to get some money back to them. You can look on the blockchain and see everyone who was issued a Veritasium coin because it's based on the Ether blockchain, which is publicly viewable. That presents a really unique problem in this sort of context, because anyone could go and file a claim based on being I could just claim that I am the owner of address XYZ that received this, thousands of coins of Veritasium, and I'm owed it. So how do we differentiate different owners, like the legitimate from potential fraudsters? I was envisioning, my nightmare scenario was someone running a script using the blockchain's information as a data and just like automatically filing their claims through our online claim portal and saying I am owed all this money because I am the owner of all these different cryptocurrency addresses that received Veritasium. So what we ended up doing was creating a unique token that we could send to each address, and it was an ERC20 token, which made them each non-fungible, unique identifier. And then the person claiming to be the owner of that address would have to send it back to us with no intervening steps. And that would prove that they owned the address, had control over it. And then we would give them their money in the form of Ether or sometimes fiat currency, depending on the person. And that claims process is actually still ongoing right now.
Oh, wow. And you helped develop that? So you also have a computer science background as well?
I didn't do any of the actual programming. It's been years. I have a computer science degree, but it's been years since I've actually dabbled with computer programming. So that was other people, but I kind of came up with the formula for what we do, like the different steps. And we discussed between the partners at Holland & Knight and the other associates involved, but I ended up drafting the claims process and the distribution methodology for that.
Mm. So are you personally, obviously you're interested in cryptocurrency, right? You're not just, this isn't just a day job thing. I assume you're personally interested in it as well?
Yeah, I'm personally interested in it. It's not going away. And I think I have enough of a computer science background to understand some of it. I mean, I'm not going to be out there creating smart contracts or anything, not yet anyway. But I understand enough to know the risks involved and how to advise people. So I think it's a perfect time right now to get involved in this space as a lawyer. There's not enough people who really can read a paper and understand what they're reading, and too many people using buzzwords to sell their services without really understanding what those mean.
Definitely. So what is your assessment of the space of cryptocurrency, I guess of Bitcoin? What do you think of the technology? What do you think its purpose is? I would just love to hear your kind of your thoughts?
So I think it's interesting, but one of my concerns is that although there's a low cost to the user for transactions, at least for the Bitcoin network, there is an incredible economic cost that's is absorbed in other ways, but it still exists per transaction. It's decentralized and it's borne by other parties, but I am a little concerned. What I would want to do is compare the economic costs per transaction of Bitcoin with other forms of currency.
You're referring to proof of work, I assume, like the mining?
Right. Yes, I'm a little concerned about that because it doesn't seem sustainable to me. I haven't studied this, but that is a concern I have. And if it's not sustainable, then we're going to end up abandoning it, or it's going to have to be streamlined in some significant way. So that's probably my chief concern right now. I think that there's a future with this sort of technology, but it may not be in the exact form that it is now. So.
And how about, so the people in Bitcoin that are most passionate about it talk about it as digital gold. What's your opinion on that? On crypto's use case as digital gold or digital cash?
I personally don't have anything invested in Bitcoin. I have invested in some of the underlying manufacturers and resources that Bitcoin mining relies on and other cryptocurrencies, but I'm not convinced that Bitcoin has long-term longevity. I have some concerns about it. It seems it's essentially like a first draft of a digital currency, and it's been cobbled together. It has a finite supply, which is not good from an economic perspective. I understand why the computer scientists who designed it did it that way, but I'm convinced that computer scientist, whoever it actually was, probably wasn't an economist. So I think we need economists involved if we're going to design a currency so that it has like all the features that we want. Bitcoin doesn't have that.
Bitcoiners are screaming at you right now as you say these things. So Monero has a tail emission. I don't know if you're familiar with that. So it doesn't have a capped supply. Monero is forever mined. There's the supply curve is known and can't be changed, but it's forever emitting coins. It reaches a nominal cap of about 18.4 million coins, and then thereafter there's a small amount of coins that are forever released, and for numerous reasons. One is essentially to ensure that there's always an incentive for miners to mine, whereas in Bitcoin the theory is that the incentive to mine will be from the transaction fees that are received, no longer from the block reward, since the block reward will eventually approach, become zero. Mm-hmm. And then also because Monero has a dynamic block size. So I don't know if you're, I'm sure you're slightly familiar with that. The block size of Bitcoin, and there was the whole block size war that happened. So in Monero, the block size is dynamic. So as usage grows, more transactions can be put into blocks, and the blocks dynamically get larger. And for technical reasons, you essentially need coins to always be emitted for that dynamic block size to work out on a game theory level, so that essentially miners don't have the incentive to just put in super large blocks, but they'll get penalized for that. That's written into the algorithm as well, and so that penalty comes from taking away from the tail emitted coins, so they would get less coins. So yeah, but to your point, I do think there might be some concerns there with the fact that Bitcoin is capped at 21 million. for economic reasons. And I think, too, for ensuring the stability of the network in the future. Like I said, right now, it's kind of an unknown. We don't really know whether or not there'll be enough incentive to mine in the future when the block reward goes to zero, especially given that most Bitcoiners will tell you that transactions are all going to move to the second layer. They'll no longer be, they won't really be taking place on the protocol layer, but they'll be taking place on the second layer. So if that's the case, then why would there be that incentive to continue to mine if transactions are moving to that second layer?
Right.
Are you studying lots of different various coins? So obviously you knew a thing or two about Monero. How is it that you came across Monero? Was it just because you were coming on the show, or had you already?
Well, I had read a little bit about it when I was first tasked to try to trace Ether transactions, because I had to learn the basics of that. But and I knew that Monero had particular difficulties in transaction tracing, because as my paper had to deal with what happens if you trace them, I had to discuss it a little bit. But I did read a little bit more about Monero in preparation for this. I did not know that the view key existed, which I thought was interesting, because what that would let you do is comply with any money laundering and know your customer requirements for changes if that became a thing. It would mitigate, I think, against the risk of illicit use, and I think is a good argument for why governments shouldn't necessarily ban it outright, as long as the exchanges or banks require users to give a certain amount of information to them so that they can confirm that the source of funds is legitimate. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think Monero in many ways, and because view key being one of the things that allows it to do it, it really mimics cash more so than any other crypto. So just like going and taking, if you take $10,000 out at the bank in cash, they knew you took the $10,000 out. So similar to, moving Monero off of a KYC AML exchange, you take your $10,000 worth of Monero off of Kraken. But then after that point, the bank no longer knows what you're doing with that money. Whereas with most other cryptos, and Bitcoin in particular, you're then can be tracked and traced thereafter.
Right.
But like with, the traditional dollar, if a warrant is put out against you or whatever it may be, you can be asked questions, and I guess you could theoretically be asked to show your view key. So it's more of, instead of the default being that the government just tracking and tracing and knows everything, they have to actually ask you for permission, which seems to be more aligned with the laws that this country is built upon for the purposes of protecting our freedoms and our liberties.
Sure, agreed. Yeah.
Do you so what is your take on the potential banning of cryptocurrencies, banning of Bitcoin or Monero? I mean, it seems more likely that they would be maybe more concerned with Monero than Bitcoin.
I think so. But I read a white paper by a law firm, and it was making a pretty good case for why even the most private of privacy coins have mechanisms that would let you comply with the current state of anti-money laundering requirements, similar to cash. I mean, if you have a large amount of cash, you essentially just tell the bank where you got it, which you can do with Monero, and you can do it a little more authentically. You can say, look, this is the source of it. I received it from this address. I mean, it doesn't really tell the bank a whole lot, but you can comply with the regulation and give them the information they want. With the blockchain, they can get a whole lot more. So I could see governments wanting to only use the more public cryptocurrencies, because of the additional information. But I think the argument should be that Monero is just as good as cash. And if we're still letting cash be used, then why not other privacy coins? I don't know if Western democracies are going to be all about banning a lot of that. I could see the more maybe tyrannical countries wanting to have their own in-house currency where they can like control the code and have maybe more information embedded in it. And they might even have some of the outward features of privacy coins, but with a backdoor letting the government, view as much information as they want. So I guess we'll see.
All right. Do you have any thoughts on taxes? So, that's obviously something that comes up. The governments may be concerned that something like Monero can be used to evade taxes, whereas I guess with Bitcoin, it would be more difficult to use it for those purposes.
Well, cash, if you use a lot of cash, it can be used to evade taxes. So I think they just have to implement the same controls they do, and which is identifying, large dollar transactions, making people report, the source of funds, and if it's income, then the bank, should be reporting that. But I don't know if blockchain. I think if there's a public ledger-based cryptocurrency, it certainly makes it easier to identify where you're possibly taxable. But there's so many other factors at play at whether you owe taxes or not. So I think at the point of an audit, you're going to have to give up your view key if you're a Monero user and show, where you got your money from, which they may not have to do if it's Bitcoin, because they can just look at it. But even then, you'll have at worst, Bitcoin is going to trace back to some digital address, and is the IRS going to know what digital address that is, like who that belongs to, or why you got that money? So I don't see the IRS like necessarily blanket banning anything, but they're going to be a little more savvy at knowing what to ask for as they deal more with this.
Mm-hmm. All right. Great insights. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Doug.
I'm really glad I came across your paper through some random Googling. I encourage anybody watching this to read it. We'll post it in the show notes to go check it out. Is there anywhere else people can find you and follow you and see what else you're working on?
I'm on LinkedIn, and when I am returning to my firm in June, so I anticipate being involved. The crypto guys are really eager to get me back to work. So hopefully we're going to put out some more exciting things. As far as I know, our distribution of cryptocurrency back to victims of these ICO frauds, especially in kind, because we're trying to give it back in Ether or in Bitcoin based on what you invested. I think it's one of the first in the world attempts to do that. So it'll be interesting to see how it pans out.
Good luck with that. And please stop by the Monero community. Come visit the Reddit. I'm sure people would love to chat with you more regarding these topics.
All right. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much, man. Appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us on this week's episode. We release new episodes every week. You can find and subscribe to the show on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you have an Alexa device, you can tell it to listen to the latest episode of the Monero Talk podcast. Go to monerotalk.live/subscribe for a full list of places where you can watch and listen. If you want to interact with us, guests, or other podcast listeners, you can follow us on Twitter. And please leave us a review on iTunes. It helps people find the show, and we are always happy to read them. So thanks so much, and we look forward to being back next week.